lecture is about mutualism and the coevolution between pollinators and their plants. So this is going to be a little bit different than the antagonistic interaction, but again, we're going to start with the same thing. Whatever our trait is, and in this case, it's going to be bill length in the pollinator, like a hummingbird, and it's going to be floral tube length in the flower. We're going to have to start out with that trait being heritable, and it's going to have to be variable, which we see it is from here, and it's also going to have to result in differential reproduction. So I can pretty much copy that and put it down here, because this trait's going to have the same thing. It's going to have to be heritable, and of course flower tube length is heritable. It also is variable in the drawing that I've brought you here, and it has to be associated with differential reproductive rates. Now, let's talk a little bit about the differential reproductive rate here. The bill length, that means that in this case, for the pollinator, one way of looking at this is to say that there must be competition for nectar. Now, that means that if you have a longer bill, you can get into sources like long tube flowers that are excluding other pollinators, so you'll have plenty to eat, right? The idea down here is that floral tube length is excluding lots of pollinators, right? This excludes pollinators, and they get more faithful pollinators, the very few that can approach them and actually feed on them. So that reduces the likelihood of there being lots of different species of pollinator going to lots of different species of plants and not actually pollinating the same species. So for this, there has to be competition for good pollinators. Now, that gets kind of complicated in pollination biology, but I think it should suffice the idea that if you have a few species, one or a few, that visit the flower, it's going to have higher pollination rates, which can then result in higher reproductive rates. So let's go back and take a look then at how this works. The bill length, those then that have the longer bills are going to be, this time I'm coloring it the other way, this is going to be selection for these guys. And because they're going to be favored because they can reach any length of plant and even the short tubes. But the plants down here that are going to do the best, so these guys are going to, we're going to have selection against. Let's do this. So in each generation, we're going to have these guys are going to move this way, as longer bills are favored because they can get into longer tubes. And when we get down here to this plant, the ones that have the longer tube are going to exclude more pollinators and be more selective, and that means we're going to have selection for these guys and selection against these guys for the shorter tubes. And that means that these are going to have higher reproductive rates, and the longer the tubes get, the more difficult it is for the pollinators to reach them. So longer tube pollinators, longer billed pollinators are favored, and then longer tubes are favored, and this continues on in this way. And this can go till we get very, very long tubes and very, very long bills. Now, the example for this, I've given you two online. One of them is the Darwin orchid moth example, and the guy in that is Phil DeVries, who's actually my graduate school advisor, and Phil is on video there. You can see him waiting for the predicted moth that Darwin said would be there. And the other one is you're going to see the tube-lipped bat. Now, the tube-lipped bat is apparently a recently discovered species of bat in Ecuador by another researcher that I had the pleasure of meeting, and they discovered this thing. It has apparently the longest tongue to body ratio of any mammal, which is pretty enormous, outstripping anteaters. But you can see these really extreme adaptations evolve when there's these close coevolutionary interactions like the ones we've described here.